Good afternoon, Anthony. Look forward to diving into the details of the pronghorn antelope in our podcast this afternoon.
Yes, well, the pronghorn, so-called antelope, better known as just simply the pronghorn because it's not an antelope. It's kind of confusing because it's a member of the family Antilocapridae, but an antilocaprid is not an antelope because an antelope is a bovid. This is, a great problem always in calling these things by their proper names, but let's just call it the pronghorn. And it's a renowned animal in many ways for a couple of reasons. One is that it's, everybody knows about its legendary speed and endurance as a runner. And it's also odd in the sense that it's the only antelope-like animal in the whole of the North American continent. So when you put those two things together, and you also consider that it's one of the few large ungulates that survived past the end of the Pleistocene, in the face of the megafaunal extinctions that accompanied human arrival in North America, it becomes quite an interesting animal to compare with, for example, true antelopes in Africa, and also with the deer that are partly sympatric with it in its home of North America.
Right. And its abundance in years gone by is also quite startling. I understand that it was population size in North America was up to 50 million animals. Is that some of the estimates out there?
That's my understanding, and the same is also true for the bison of North America, which was apparently also found in astonishing numbers. So that prairie ecosystem, that is shared by the bison and the pronghorn, seems to have been astonishingly productive based on a kind of an annual migration system. So, a given patch of prairie might not have any animals on it at a certain time of the year. But if you take the full annual migration circuit into account, then where the animals were found, they were found in astonishing abundance. And the interesting thing about the pronghorn was that it fit in to the guilds very nicely because the pronghorn and the bison do completely different things. And so they can coexist side by side very nicely in the sense that the bison is very much a grazer, whereas the pronghorn, unlike most true antelopes in Africa, is very much a forb eater. Right. It's such an unusual thing that there's no actual category for it in the literature, because in Africa we talk about browsers versus grazers, but referring to the pronghorn as a browser is a kind of misleading categorization, because it's not so much a browser as a forb eater. And a forb is a herbaceous dicotyledonous plant, a bit like a dandelion in your garden. So the pronghorn is odd compared to gazelles and alsalafan antelopes in the sense that it eats mainly a different kind of plant, which is a herbaceous dicotyledonous plant. And because intense grazing by the bison essentially removed the grass and allowed these weedy perennials, particularly in the daisy family, to grow in lieu of grass. Therefore, the two animals were complementary. And in a sense, the bison made food for the pronghorn, but the pronghorn did not compete with the bison at all for food. So it's a nice little system, even though it's very simple. It's a system that is appealing to the ecologist because there's great abundance and productivity involved. And there's also an intriguing simplicity compared to the multi-species communities of ungulates in African savannas and grasslands.
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks. So forbs are abundant in African savannas as well. There are no mammals specializing on eating them. If we look at our antelope in Africa, they'll eat forbs on occasion. Is that right? The grazers will still eat a forb here and there, but is the forb community in Africa being utilized intensely as well, or is it this open niche, as it were?
No, I think it is being utilized, but I think there's a difference in scale. it's difficult to be sure because very few of us African ecologists have spent much time in the American prairies and vice versa. But this is the impression I have, that there are forbs in both systems and there's a considerable diversity. But in African savannas, asteraceous forbs in the sunflower family or the daisy family are not particularly common, whereas in the North American prairies and in the surrounding semi-deserts like the Great Basin sagebrush communities, Asteraceae, the daisies, are overwhelmingly abundant and also very diverse. So in a typical African savanna, you do have forbs, but they're rather small. They tend not to be particularly vigorous growers. They tend to be not particularly palatable, and the only ruminants that really semi-specialize on them are small and scattered creatures such as the steenbok and perhaps the common duiker. Whereas in the North American situation, it's almost like a weed lot, a natural weed lot, where an area intensively grazed by the bison is almost like similar to what you see when you demolish a house in a city and all these ruderal weeds come up, these vigorous weedy daisies. And it's those kinds of weeds which I have the impression are much more rude and vigorous than their counterparts in African savannas. That's what the pronghorn really capitalizes on, as I understand it. So there's a kind of a difference there's a quantitative difference. There's just much more going on with regard to forbs in American prairies than in African savannas.
Yeah, and this migration of the pronghorn, is it like the migration one sees in today in the Serengeti with the wildebeest, or the cob in South Sudan? That's a particular route the animals follow, a seasonal route, whereas when I think of the springbuck migrations in southern Africa in the 1800s, those seem to be more like eruptions based on particular weather conditions and not a routine annual seasonal shift. What do we have a sense of what the 50 million pronghorn we're doing in comparison?
Well, that's a very good way of framing the question. And because your framing is novel, there's no literature that addresses it in the context that you've just mentioned. But certainly the impression you get from the literature is that the migrations were much more like the regular Serengeti type migrations, but on a larger scale. And so, my impression is that with the pronghorn, they had a regular north-south migration route each annual cycle, but the distances involved were considerable. I mean, several hundreds of kilometers at least, whereas the Serengeti migration, although very impressive, is kind of a pretty limited circuit. I mean, you can walk from one end of the Serengeti wildebeest migration to the other in a matter of a day or two. It's not a long way, really. So the same would not, I don't think, be true for the pronghorn. You're talking about a considerable distance because the prairie is a long system, longitudinally from Alberta all the way down to New Mexico. It's a great distance with a very harsh winter climate. It's a much more seasonal environment than applies to any of the African migrations, including the Highveld in South Africa, because most of the pronghorn habitat is icy in winter. Some of it covered in snow, and so its living conditions are radically altered from winter to summer in a way that's not true even in the Free State on the Highveld of South Africa, which is in the temperate zone.
Yeah. So were these pronghorn escaping the winter? They would move to New Mexico to survive the winter?
Basically, yes. I mean, not necessarily all the way down to New Mexico, but there was a considerable shift southwards in winter for obvious reasons, because there's just not much to eat in the grip of the icy prairie winter in northern parts of the United States and in western Canada.
And the bison did the same?
The bison presumably did the same, yes. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
There's a slight difference.
To think of 50 million pronghorn making that migration. It's just astounding.
Yes, well, the numbers are astounding, but the simplicity of the guild is also astounding because for two reasons. One is that, with a grounding in African savannas, one expects many different ungulates all to be having their own little niche and fitting into a kind of a complex guild. That's the default assumption based on Africa, and that's not the case in North America, because basically it was on the open grasslands of North America. It was basically just the bison and the pronghorn, with a little bit of participation around the edges where trees come in by the wapiti and the mule deer. But out on the open grassland itself, just two species. And even in that case, the pronghorn was a little bit different from the bison because it penetrated the sagebrush semi-deserts around and mainly to the west of the prairies in a way that the bison didn't, because in these sagebrush semi-deserts epitomized by the state of Nevada today, the pronghorn could still eat a daisy in the form of the perennial daisy Artemisia tridentata as a kind of second best choice to its preferred diet of forbs, but the bison certainly couldn't accommodate to that environment because there's basically no grass in that semi-desert sagebrush community. So pronghorn do quite well in sagebrush semi-desert, but they also originally coexisted with the bison, probably I wouldn't say throughout the bison range, because the bison went all the way into the eastern states in a way that the pronghorn didn't. And so now that I think of it, you can speak of the bison and the habit and the pronghorn as having widely overlapping habitats, but with a difference around the edges, in the sense that the pronghorn went more into the dry country than the bison, and the bison went more into the moist wooded areas of the east than the pronghorn did.
Right, and you mentioned the mule deer and the wapiti. The white-tailed deer isn't on the edges; it's more in the forests. Is that right?
Well, that's right. I mean, the white-tailed deer penetrated that system, but only along drainage lines where there was considerable cover, whereas the mule deer can get out into the open to some degree.
Right. Okay. And the pronghorn is famous for various traits like stamina and speed. Should we perhaps discuss that, or are there other oddities around the pronghorn that you'd like to look at first?
Well, I think we should attend to the other oddities second, because they're not as well known as the stamina and speed. So let's certainly later, probably in a second podcast, let's look at the breeding habits of the pronghorn, which are different from those of antelopes. But for now, I think let's talk about the speed and the stamina. You see, the main problem with the speed and the stamina of the pronghorn is that it doesn't seem to make adaptive sense. And instead of addressing that anomaly head on, evolutionary biologists have tended to kind of, how can I put it, pretend that it's not as big an evolutionary puzzle as it actually is. So what is the puzzle? The puzzle is that the pronghorn is regarded as probably the most impressive athletic performer of all ungulates worldwide in the living fauna, in the sense of a combination of speed and endurance. It's astonishingly fast and enduring. It's one thing to be fast like a cheetah. It's another thing to be fast and enduring like a pronghorn. And as far as we know, that kind of performance is not actually matched by even the speediest and most enduring of African antelopes, such as the alsalafins. It's hard to be exactly sure because nobody's done a direct comparison, but it seems to be generally agreed on by those who are qualified that the pronghorn is without match in this particular regard. And that's a puzzle, I guess, it raises two questions associated with the primary puzzle. One is, what is it about the body of the pronghorn that enables it to have such astonishing performance? And secondly, why does it have that performance in the first place? Because presumably its performance was originally adapted in order to be an anti-predator strategy or tactic, and yet in its modern form for the last 10,000 years, the pronghorn has had not much predation to speak of, and certainly not more predation than you would find for a corresponding animal in African savannas. So to summarize the anomaly, why is the pronghorn such an astonishing athlete, considering that, if anything, it has less predation bearing down upon it than an Al-Salafan antelope in Africa does? And then secondly, if it is indeed true that the pronghorn is this superb athlete, what is it about the animal's body that enables it to outperform, for example, a hartebeest or a topi or a blesbok in Africa?
Is it not possible, Anthony, that the answer's linked to the speed and stamina of the wolf in comparison to the speed and stamina of cheetah, leopard, lion, hunting dog in Africa? Perhaps this whole system, wolf and pronghorn, operates at a faster rate than in the African predators and prey.
Yes, that is possible. It's possible that the wolf was continually present on the prairies in the Holocene 10,000 years since the megafaunal extinctions, and that species alone, the wolf, was a formidable enough cursorial predator on the pronghorn to account for its superb performance. That is possible. But what's interesting about that is never invoked. If you look in the literature about the pronghorn, people don't say that. They don't say that the pronghorn evolved its speed and stamina in response to the wolf. What they say instead is something that makes much less sense, and that is that the speed and stamina are holdovers, if you like, sort of evolutionary ghosts from a situation past, when in the Pleistocene there were far more predators around in that landscape than there are today.
Okay.
And so the problem with that interpretation is twofold. Number one is it seems to contradict the principle of adaptation, that an animal can simply proceed into an environment to which it's no longer adapted. In the sense that the predators that caused its original performance are now subtracted from the equation, and yet it carries on as if that doesn't matter. That doesn't make a lot of adaptive sense, because there are costs to that capacity for performance. And secondly, even if you go back to the Pleistocene, to a time when there were so many astonishingly impressive predators in Pleistocene America, that when the first humans crossed the Bering Strait and entered North America, they must have been living in terror of various extremely impressive predators, such as saber-toothed felids, the dire wolf, which is more formidable again than the modern wolf, and a series of short-faced bears that combined large size, immense strength of the jaws, and an actual cursorial ability far greater than modern bears. And so nobody's doubting that the Pleistocene predatory environment in what is now pronghorn habitat was more formidable than that on the African savannas today. But the problem is that none of those predators in the Pleistocene had the kind of demonstrated cursoriality that could actually account for the performance of the pronghorn itself. What you have to come up with is some kind of predator that can really match the pronghorn, leading to a kind of arms race that would account for the superb athletic ability of the pronghorn. Does that make sense?
No, it does. And are you saying that the current wolf could be that animal?
It's possible. I think that's actually one of the more plausible explanations. But what's really interesting about that is that, as I've said, it's never invoked. I've never seen. Yeah. Maybe I need to search harder, but in nothing that I've ever read about the pronghorn does anybody ever say that. So let's be clear about what is not said. I'm not commenting on whether it's true or false. I'm just remarking on the oddity of it not being proposed. And what's not being proposed is that all of the superb athletic ability of the pronghorn in speed and endurance is simply accounted for by the fact that it has continued to be in an arms race, as it were, with the modern wolf, Canis lupus, which survived the megafaunal extinctions and has lived side by side with the pronghorn for the last, 9,500 years before European arrival. That is a parsimonious and reasonable explanation, but it is never invoked. What is instead invoked is either that the pronghorn just simply carried on with its performance after there was no need for it in an anti-predator context, or that a particular extinct cheetah-like cat, which may have matched the cheetah in speed, was one of the main reasons why the pronghorn had to evolve to the extreme degree that it did. And that latter explanation involving this American cheetah called Miracinonyx doesn't make sense, because if it's like the modern cheetah, it could chase it rapidly for a short way, but can't possibly account for the extreme endurance of the pronghorn, because the pronghorn can run fast for a very long way that cannot be matched by any felid as far as we know. So nothing makes sense in this whole equation. And the one thing that makes the most sense, which is your suggestion that it's simply down to the modern wolf, for some reason that's never invoked. Nobody puts that forward.
Okay, fascinating. And then if it is the modern wolf, the enormous elephant in the room is, well, why would that wolf be so much stronger in terms of stamina and speed than the African predators?
Well, that's a very good question. How does the African hunting dog, for example, compare to the wolf in America? It's a complicated question. Firstly, the African hunting dog is a little bit smaller bodied. It's a much more specialized animal. And the African hunting dog fits into the interstices of the African predator community, because you see the difference, the main difference between America and Africa in the Holocene has been that the wolf has been top dog in America. It's the most formidable predator on that continent since the megafaunal extinctions.
Yeah.
It's the super carnivore, whereas the African hunting dog, although arguably as fast and enduring and as gregarious in its hunting, is very much an underdog in Africa. It's living basically in the interstices of animals more powerful than itself, particularly the lion and the spotted hyena. And for that reason, it's scarce, it's temporary in a particular area, and it tends to die out periodically in any given patch. And so the African hunting dog is not a dominant animal. And it's difficult to imagine that the African hunting dog could explain any particular anti-predator syndrome in any of its prey, because it's just it's almost there as a grudging guest of the more dominant carnivores, particularly the lion and the spotted hyena, and they will always kill the hunting dog when they can. Now the same is in principle true in America, because the puma and the grizzly bear would surely kill the wolf where they can. But the point is that in America, the wolf is actually the one with the superior power.
But then the question for me is, why is a wolf such a faster carnivore with greater stamina than the spotted hyena or the lion? I guess we would start invoking nutritional differences between the continents.
Well, in the case of the lion, there's no real puzzle, because nobody expects the lion to be an enduring pursuer. I think that the most appropriate comparison is, as you said, between the wolf and the spotted hyena. They are comparable. So the question then becomes, why is it the case that under predation pressure by the wolf, the pronghorn had to achieve this super performance of athleticism, whereas under the long-standing predation pressure from the spotted hyena in Africa, ostensibly no antelope, including the really fast and enduring running alsalafins, achieved the same kind of performance. And not only has that question never been answered, but that question has never actually been clearly asked in the way that we've just asked it. So, but you see, my curiosity about the performance of the pronghorn led me to do something unusual in the last few days, which is actually to look at some of the reputed features of the pronghorn to see whether they really are true or perhaps exaggerated. And what I focused on was the heart size. Now, if you go into the literature, the semi-popular literature, it's often simply stated as a fact that the pronghorn has a huge heart, which seems to make perfect sense considering its speed and endurance. But it just it sounded a little too on the nose for me, you know. And so I looked into the actual paper trail, and what I found, to my surprise, was that it doesn't seem to be true. And I don't know if you'd like to discuss the details of that one. Yeah. Well, you see, the original publication that stated that the pronghorn has a huge heart was published in 1974. That's about, half a century ago. And that was based on a single comparison between the pronghorn and the domestic goat. And what they found was that the domestic goat has a heart size relative to body size about half of that of the pronghorn. And so what people then did is they made a kind of an implicit assumption, and a tacit assumption, an unthinking assumption, which is that if the pronghorn's heart is twice as big as that of the domestic goat of similar body size, then that probably also applies to antelopes. But it doesn't apply to antelopes because the goat is the odd one out. It's a domestic animal that has been subject to a kind of inadvertent anthropogenic selective process in which the heart size has actually shrunk in the transition from the original wild animal to its modern domestic counterpart. And so a goat has a relative heart mass of about 0.5%. So the heart mass expressed as a percentage of body mass is about 0.5%, which is about the same as you and me. Humans have the same percentage, and we're hardly astonishingly fast or enduring runners. So what happened in the domestication of the caprins, both the goat and the sheep, is that the original large-hearted wild ancestor, the original wild goat and the original wild sheep, were subjected inadvertently, not intentionally, but inadvertently, to a selective process that reduced the brain, that encouraged aspects of the anatomy that were useful in domestication, like the fat in the sheep, for example, that made the animals more docile, more productive, more convenient to human interests. And because the animals don't have to flee in domestication, the heart was one of the first to be sacrificed, in the sense that the heart shrank maybe at least a third of its size down to something more approaching the human species. And then, when these original authors in 1974 made this comparison between the goat and the pronghorn, what was not pointed out was that was not an appropriate comparison to make. They should have compared it with a blesbok or an impala or even a white-tailed deer, because a white-tailed deer, as it turns out, which is not a particularly impressive runner at all in the North American context, has a heart every bit as large as that of the pronghorn.
Okay.
So this whole idea that there's something exceptional about the heart size of the pronghorn disappears like a mirage when you actually compare it to animals that are appropriate for the comparison: the blesbok, the impala, the white-tailed deer, and presumably also the mule deer, the Tibetan gazelle, and so forth. There's nothing particularly big about the heart of the pronghorn, after all, although the aerobic capacity and the cardiovascular performance may be more impressive for different reasons. Does that make sense?
No, it does. We discussed its stamina and speed. It's clear that that's not coming from a relatively large heart. So what do you think the underlying physiological principles are that enable the pronghorn to run so much faster and for so much longer, further than the African antelopes?
Well, that's a question that is partly answered by the literature, because there are some good physiological papers that have shown various metabolic and physiological parameters to be very impressive in the pronghorn, like the rate at which oxygen can be delivered to the muscles. So without going into the sort of technical details of that, there's some good science done showing that the pronghorn makes the most of its heart, it makes the most of its lungs, and it has, features such as red blood cells and oxygen delivery capacity that sustain this kind of speed and endurance. So that's not really mysterious at that level.
Yeah.
But you see, it still raises the question of why has a similar capacity for performance not evolved in some African animal?
Yeah.
Considering that there must surely have been enough predation pressure from, say, the spotted hyena and the African hunting dog to cause at least one of the African antelopes to match the pronghorn in performance. And here we have a new possibility that's never really been mooted in the literature before, and that has to do with the observation that in Africa, if you chase these plains game animals, for example, in game capture operations, at top speed for a long time, they survive, but they tend to succumb after a few days in the holding pen to a thing called white muscle disease, which is a manifestation of a subclinical deficiency in selenium, which is a trace element particularly important for muscle function. And so what's interesting about that is that the habitat of the pronghorn is rich in selenium compared to African savannas because of the geological nature of North America. And so what seems to be the case is that the pronghorn, just by sheer good fortune, happens to have evolved in a selenium-rich prairie, as opposed to the African counterparts, which have evolved in a rather selenium-poor prairie. And because of that nutritional limitation on the African animals, we have a situation where there was not the physical resource base for the African plains game to evolve quite the same capacity for speed and stamina as we see in the pronghorn.
So in summary, we're saying the arms race between the wolf and the pronghorn went further than the arms race between the spotted hyena and various African antelope because selenium was the resource limiting the African animals, and the wolf and the pronghorn just took that race a lot further down the line, using all the selenium available.
Well, that's right. So it's a kind of a nutritional explanation. So where we're going with this, our conceptual framework is such that you can explain the differences between the pronghorn on the one hand and its African antelope counterparts on the other by a combination of climatic differences, with the much snowier winter in North America than in Africa, and also by nutritional differences in which the prairies are generally more nutrient rich in all elements than the African savannas, and they're particularly rich in an often overlooked trace element, selenium, which is crucial for performance specifically.
Okay.
And the point is that although this is just an idea that has yet to be tested, from a philosophy of science point of view, what's interesting to point out is that it's a categorically different kind of explanation from the one that you'll find uniformly in the literature and on the internet, which is that the pronghorn the performance of the pronghorn makes no sense in the modern context, but is simply a kind of accidental holdover from a time in history in the Pleistocene when it needed to run that far and that fast because there were certain predators around which are no longer in the picture. So our explanation is an intensely adaptive and ecological explanation, whereas that commonly invoked explanation is one based on accidents of history. And the problem with accidents of history is that fundamentally, by their nature, they tend to be contradictory to the principles of natural selection and adaptation.
No, fantastic. This is looking at it from a continental perspective. It strikes me that when one drills into more granular detail, some questions emerge. Like the Serengeti is actually fairly selenium rich, from what I understand, the short grass Serengeti systems. And then the Pampas is also selenium rich, but there were no antelope herds to speak of. So questions emerge, but I think we're talking about broad principles across the whole of the prairies in North America versus the whole of the African savannas. Would you agree with it's different scales?
Yes, it's different scales. I mean, I think the Serengeti ecosystem, although it may have a relatively selenium-rich core area of treeless grassland, is very likely to be selenium poorer than a corresponding area of the American prairies in general.
Okay.
But the anomaly you pointed out about the Pampas in Argentina is a very real one, and that's why it takes a fairly stout heart to be an intellectually honest ecologist, because every time one comes up with a plausible explanation for some evolutionary anomaly, it seems just to raise at least one other new question that is as befuddling as the original question. So it's a kind of a game, a thinking game, because we probably will never really explain these anomalies in objective terms, but it's fun giving it a go.
Yeah.
And I prefer the explanations that make sort of logical sense rather than the ones that invoke historical accidents, because historical accidents are a kind of a cop-out in the sense that they abandon principle for convenience, and in that way undermine a kind of a rigor in science that we should always try to uphold whenever possible.
Great. And it also keeps the flame of curiosity alive, in that we've now got a new framing for thinking about the pronghorn and the wolf and the spotted hyena and African antelope, and whereas we'll, as the decades go by, we'll collect information to see whether it fits with that framing or not. Whereas if you invoke the accident of history, you're basically shutting down the question, and you don't have a hypothesis to use to assess new information that comes to light.
Well, that's exactly right. And in closing this podcast, maybe we should just recap. Maybe you could help me here to recap the main questions that we've raised. One of the questions about the pronghorn is, why is it that the community in which the pronghorn exists in the Holocene is such a simple, basically two-species community compared to the diverse community in African savannas? Another question is, why did the pronghorn evolve to have this superlative running performance? What was the original predatory environment that produced that? Question number 3 is, given the removal of those predators, if it's true that the predators involved were now extinct Pleistocene ones, how is it possible for the pronghorn to sail on successfully in the absence of one of its original contexts, as it were? And then an additional puzzle is, what is it about the pronghorn's physiology, anatomy, and metabolism that enables such performance, given that it turns out not to be a big heart? There may be other puzzles involved, but those are at least some of the puzzles we've raised.
Yeah, there were some sub-puzzles as well, like why are forbs so much more prevalent in a prairie ecosystem compared with the African savannas and grasslands?
Yes, I mean, my initial response to that would be that it's just such a more fertile and also more seasonal environment. It's more like more like an agricultural environment.
Okay.
But that also raises a sub puzzle in the context of the great prevalence of daisy family plants in the American prairies compared to the African savannas. But both of those puzzles seem minor to me because they kind of make sense. We have so much experience of agricultural ecosystems in our world that to see a kind of a rude vigorous forward field of daisies is not that strange an experience given the fertility and the seasonal climate of the prairies. It is a puzzle, but it's not a major one.
But it does link nicely into the idea that the wolf and pronghorn arms race is underpinned by extreme fertility.
Yes, it is indeed. Yeah, it does seem to hold water, that one could view the pronghorn as the result of a particular ecosystem in which there's great fertility, including certain crucial trace elements like selenium. And that great fertility results in a simple herbivore community, but also one with intense predation because of the productivity, because of the reliability of the prey for the wolf, and because the wolf is indeed a superlative gregarious cursorial hunter. The pronghorn has had to go to lengths unseen in Africa in order to maintain the principle of an arms race, and that there is no real collapse after the Pleistocene in that regime, because all it takes is for the wolf to survive the Pleistocene megafaunal carnivore extinctions, for the predatory environment of the pronghorn to remain basically the same. And so again, that all sounds great, but the problem is nobody has ever suggested that before, as far as I know.
Yeah. Well, very enjoyable thinking it through like this, Anthony. And I'm sure the pronghorn will continue to occupy our thoughts in the weeks ahead.
Yes, indeed. And to listeners, please like, subscribe, and share. And we look forward to chatting more about the pronghorn in our next item. And until then, over and out from us.
Cheers.